A line is a one-dimensional figure which has length but no width. A line is made up of a set of points which is extended in opposite directions infinitely. It is determined by 2 points in a two-dimensional plane. In geometry, there are different types of lines such as horizontal and vertical lines, parallel and perpendicular lines. These lines play an important role in the constructing of different types of polygons. But now, the lines that we are going to tackle is the parallel line and the perpendicular lines. Good day everyone, I am Elka Pierginti and I am one of the group member who are going to report the parallel and perpendicular lines. After these lessons, pupils are expected to determine the parallel lines from perpendicular lines, determine perpendicular lines from parallel lines. Next is identify real-life objects of parallel and perpendicular lines, and lastly, contrast parallel lines from perpendicular lines. Now, what is parallel and perpendicular lines? Parallel and perpendicular lines are an important part of geometry and they have distinct characteristics that help to identify them easily. First is the parallel line. Parallel line is two straight lines lie in the same plane. Another is never intersect each other and always the same distance apart and are equidistant lines. Symbol used to present parallel lines is shown below. Next is the characteristics of perpendicular lines. Perpendicular lines are two lines that intersect each other at an angle of 90 degrees. And the perpendicular lines are denoted by the symbol shown below. Now, let's move on to the properties of parallel lines. Parallel lines are always equidistant from each other and they never meet at any common point. They lie in the same plane. So, I have here an example of parallel line. The red line and the blue line are parallel in both of these examples. Lines are parallel if they are always in the same distance apart. That's what we call equidistance and will never meet. They also point in the same direction, always the same distance apart and never touching. That is how to identify parallel lines. Now let's proceed to the properties of perpendicular lines. Perpendicular lines always intersect at 90 degrees and all perpendicular lines can be termed as intersecting lines, but all intersecting lines cannot be called perpendicular because they need to intersect at right angles. So I have here an example of a perpendicular line. So line AB is perpendicular to line CD. Why? Because they intersect at the right angle measuring the 90 degree. That's why we call perpendicular lines. The two lines must cross at right angles to each other just to be called perpendicular lines. Always remember that all intersecting lines cannot be called perpendicular lines, but perpendicular lines can be termed as intersecting lines. Now, let's differentiate the difference between the parallel and perpendicular lines. Although parallel and perpendicular lines are the two basic and most commonly used lines in geometry, they are quite different from each other. The following table shows the difference between parallel and perpendicular lines. For parallel lines are those that never intersect and are always the same distance apart, while perpendicular lines are those that always intersect each other at right angles. Next is the symbol of the parallel lines is different from the perpendicular lines. The example of parallel lines are the railway tracks, the opposite sides of a whiteboard. Whereas the example of perpendicular lines are the letter L, because as you can see, letter L have they intersect at the right angle. Another is the joining walls of your classroom or your house.
I'm Jovelyn Basilisco, and now let's move forward to the difference between parallel and perpendicular lines. Although parallel and perpendicular lines are the two basic and most common use in lines in geometry, they are quite different from each other. Parallel lines are those that never intersect and are always the same distance apart. The symbol is Two line is used to represent, and example for this are the railway track, opposite side of the whiteboard, and so on. While perpendicular lines are those that always intersect each other at a right angle or measure 90-degree angle. Perpendicular line are denoted by the symbol of Murasya Gihayanga letter T. Example for this is the letter L, the joining walls of a room. Now we have the instructional materials and parallel lines. The best way or the easiest way to determine parallel lines is to use the real-life object. We have here the edges of ruler or rules. As we all know, a ruler is used to draw straight line and other figures. If a line is traced along one side of a ruler and another line is drawn using the opposite side, the resultant line will be a parallel line. Next, we have the zebra crossing or the pedestrian lane. A pedestrian lane is a portion of the road that is painted with white stripes. These white stripes are called parallel to each other. Why? Wala man sila nag-abot. Nakakita mo anang or nakabantay mo anang sa market or sa eskwelahan na diha makita na to ang pedestrian lane. Next, electrical wires. Electrical power generated by the powerhouse reaches our home with the help of the wires attached to the electricity poles. These wires can be easily seen along the roadside. The wires are separated from each other at a distance. Next is the ruled paper. The lines printed on the ruled paper are also equidistant from each other. These lines tend to meet each other at infinity. Next, the steps of a ladder. The steps of a ladder or hagdan in Bisaya are also equidistant from each other at every instant. Also, the slope of all the steps is the same. Lastly, plastic straws. Plastic straw is the most common tool used to represent the parallel line. Now let us move forward to the instructional materials and perpendicular lines. First, we have the box. We all know that box has all sides are equal, and in its edge it forms a 90-degree angle. That's why we can represent box as a perpendicular lines. Next, television. At the edge of the television, it can deform 90-degree angle, which represent the perpendicular line. Next, we have the edges of ruler, edges of a carton, postcard, and also the edges of the money. Next, we have the window. The edges of the window can be formed perpendicular lines. And next is the floor tiles. Last one is the kite. In this example, in angle A and D is a perpendicular line. Now let's move forward to the instructional activities and parallel and perpendicular lines. First, we have here, all you need to do is, the direction is identify whether parallel lines or perpendicular lines. Just write your answer inside the box. Next is perpendicular and parallel line. In letter A, you need to label which is the perpendicular or the parallel, and in B, which shape has perpendicular lines, in C, which shape does not have any parallel lines, in D, which shape does not have two sets of perpendicular lines. Next, in this activity, all you need to do is to choose 4 objects with perpendicular lines. Next is all you need to do is to select perpendicular or parallel depending on the lines. And the one here is write yes if the line is a parallel and no if it's not.
Now for our next activity, you are going to identify the following given pair of lines as parallel, perpendicular, or intersecting lines. And in the right side, there is another activity, and which is, can I identify different types of line? There is a task A, task B, and task C. In this activity, you are going to answer what are the questions asked in the task A, task B, and task C. So that's all for our report, which is the parallel and perpendicular lines. Thank you for watching.